The grand ballroom erupted in gasps as the crystal goblet shattered at Lady Isolde Montague's feet, its fragments glittering like fallen stars under the relentless chandeliers. There she stood, tear-streaked and defiant in her ivory silk gown, locked in Viscount Everett Blackwood's fierce embrace. His hand cradling her neck, her fingers clutching his dark coat. As society's vultures circled, their whispers turning to venomous accusations of scandal and deception. In that suspended moment, with the crowd's judgment pressing like a noose, Isolde realized her heart's perilous choice. Surrender to the man who saw her true worth, or shatter under the weight of ruinous lies. If this heartbeat of defiance gripped you, hit subscribe now, because the revelations ahead will shatter everything you thought possible in love's shadowed dance. The chandeliers of Eldridge Hall burned with a ferocity that mocked the winter night outside, their crystal prisms fracturing light into 1,000 merciless shards. Every flame, every gilded mirror, every polished surface seemed designed to expose rather than adorn, as if the house itself conspired to lay bare the secrets of those who dared enter its domain. Lady Isolde Montague stood alone near a towering arrangement of hothouse roses, their crimson petals too perfect, too fragrant, a cruel reminder of wealth she could no longer claim. Her gown of ivory silk, painstakingly altered by her own hands to conceal the places where older fabric had been let out or turned, clung to her slender frame with quiet elegance. To the untrained eye, she was flawless. Dark curls pinned with borrowed pearls, skin luminous as fresh cream, eyes the color of storm clouds over the North Sea. Yet every admiring glance that lingered too long carried the same silent calculation. Beautiful, yes, but for how long, and at what true cost? She felt the weight of those calculations like a physical burden pressing against her ribs. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, spoken only that morning in the dim breakfast room of their leased townhouse. Tonight is not for pleasure, Isolde. It is for survival. Lord Reginald Montague had aged a decade in the past 3 years, his once steady hands now trembling as he passed her the last of the family jewels to pawn. The creditors had grown impatient. The townhouse lease would expire within the month. Her younger sister Alara's first season, once a cherished dream, now hovered on the edge of impossibility. Isolde lifted her chin, forcing the practiced serenity onto her features. She had perfected the art of stillness long ago, how to stand as though rooted in confidence while panic clawed at her insides. Around her, the ballroom pulsed with life. Debutantes in pastel clouds giggling behind fans, matrons in heavy jewels dissecting reputations with surgical precision, gentlemen in flawless black coats circling like wolves scenting vulnerability. The orchestra tuned for the next set, violins sighing into harmony. Couples began to pair off, the floor filling with graceful motion. Isolde remained at the edge, untouched by invitations. No one wished to risk association with a family teetering on disgrace. She told herself it did not sting. She lied well even to herself. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened with ceremonial flourish, and the atmosphere shifted as palpably as if a winter wind had swept through the room. Viscount Everett Blackwood had arrived. Conversation dipped, then surged again in hushed excitement. He moved with the unhurried authority of a man who owned every space he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black that made the other gentlemen appear almost frivolous. He cut a path through the crowd without effort. His hair was raven dark, swept back from a face carved from granite, high cheekbones, a mouth set in perpetual restraint, eyes the color of obsidian catching candlelight like polished stone. Widowed 3 years ago under circumstances society still whispered about with delicious horror, he had retreated into icy solitude, emerging only when duty demanded. Rumors clung to him like frost, that his late wife had betrayed him spectacularly, that he had loved her fiercely and been destroyed for it, that no woman would ever breach his defenses again. Isolde should have looked away. She should have joined the pretended indifference of the other ladies, fluttering fans to hide their fascination. Instead, she found herself trapped by the slow sweep of his gaze as it traveled the room. When it reached her, it did not glide past. It stopped, held, pinned her in place with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. There was no smile, no nod of polite acknowledgement, only a prolonged, deliberate assessment, as though he were stripping away every layer of artifice she had so carefully constructed. Heat rose unbidden to her cheeks. She felt suddenly exposed, as if the mended seams of her gown had become visible to the entire assembly. Why her, among heiresses draped in fortunes? Why fix upon the one woman who possessed nothing but a tarnished name and desperate eyes? The moment stretched unbearable, until at last he turned away, accepting a glass of champagne from a footman without breaking stride. The spell shattered. Isolde exhaled shakily, pressing gloved fingers to her throat where her pulse hammered wildly. Across the room, her cousin Lady Seraphina Vale watched with narrowed emerald eyes, lips curving in a smile that held no warmth. Seraphina's gown of blood-red silk proclaimed her confidence, her position secure through a prudent marriage. She had always viewed Isolde as both rival and opportunity, a beautiful pawn to be maneuvered or sacrificed as needed. The music swelled into the opening strains of a waltz. Couples flooded the floor. Isolde remained where she was, a solitary figure amid the glittering tide, acutely aware that the night had only just begun, and that something irrevocable had already been set in motion. What would you do in this moment of raw vulnerability? Stand poised beneath the merciless light, or flee before the storm breaks? Comment below and let me know. Isolde slipped through a side door onto the narrow balcony that overlooked the gardens, desperate for a moment of air untainted by perfume and pretense. The night was sharp with January frost. Her breath clouded before her as she gripped the cold stone balustrade. Below, lantern-lit paths wound between skeletal rosebushes, and the distant strains of the waltz drifted out like mocking laughter. She closed her eyes, allowing the chill to bite her cheeks, hoping it might numb the ache that had settled permanently behind her ribs. 5 years ago, none of this would have been necessary. She could still summon the memory with painful clarity. Montague Manor in summer, its honey-colored stone glowing under a generous sun, lawns rolling down to the river where she and Alara had raced barefoot, shrieking with laughter. Their mother, Lady Charlotte, had sat on the terrace with her embroidery, humming softly, her golden hair catching the light like a halo. Their father had been a different man then, vital, confident, the sort whose booming laugh filled rooms and whose credit was unquestioned in every shop from London to Bath. Debts had existed, of course. Great houses always carried them, but they had been manageable, distant thunder on a clear day. Then came the investments. Lord Reginald had been persuaded by a charming consortium of gentlemen, men with titles and plausible smiles, that a venture in colonial cotton would yield fortunes overnight. A sure thing, they had assured him over brandy at his club. He poured everything in, the unentailed lands, the dowry portion set aside for his daughters, even the jewels that had belonged to Isolde's grandmother. Mother had protested quietly, but father's enthusiasm had overruled her caution. For a season, the gamble seemed brilliant. Letters arrived boasting of warehouses filling, prices soaring, until the market collapsed. One morning the post brought not triumph but ruin. Margins called, partners vanished, ships lost to storm or seizure. By evening, the vultures descended, creditors demanding immediate repayment, tradesmen refusing further credit, neighbors offering sympathy that tasted of scorn. Lady Charlotte's health, already fragile, crumbled under the strain. She lingered through one cruel winter, fading like a candle in wind, until fever finally claimed her on a night when the river froze solid outside her window. Isolde had been 16. She held her mother's hand as the light left those once bright eyes, heard the final whispered instruction. Take care of them, my love. You are the strong one. Strength, Isolde had since learned, was simply endurance wearing a braver face. After the funeral, the dismantling began. First the London house was let go. Then the hunters sold, the servants reduced to a skeletal few. Montague Manor itself remained, for now, but only because no buyer had yet met father's stubbornly inflated price. Each year brought fresh economies. Gowns turned and ret-rimmed, jewels pawned one by one, Alara's music lessons abandoned. Isolde had quietly taken over the household accounts, learning to stretch shillings into miracles, forging her father's signature on letters that begged extensions from impatient lenders. And through it all, she had armored herself in beauty and silence. Beauty was the one asset no creditor could seize. It drew invitations that might otherwise have dried up entirely, kept her in the marriage mart long after her lack of portion should have disqualified her. Silence protected what little pride remained. She had learned never to flinch when dowagers murmured such a pity behind their fans, never to protest when gentlemen's eyes assessed her like horseflesh at Tattersall's. But tonight the armor felt thinner than ever. Back inside, warmth enveloped her again, along with the renewed press of bodies and speculation. She moved along the edge of the ballroom, accepting a glass of negus from a footman with a murmured thanks. Near the card-room doors, she spotted her father deep in conversation with a portly baronet known for lending at ruinous interest. Lord Reginald's smile was too wide, his gestures too animated. She knew the signs of desperation disguised as bonhomie. A soft rustle of silk announced Serafina's approach. "Cousin," Serafina said, materializing at her elbow like a crimson spectre. "You look peaky. The heat, perhaps? Or something more burdensome?" Her green eyes flicked meaningfully toward Lord Reginald. Isolde met the gaze steadily. Serafina had always resented the Montague beauty that outshone her own sharper features, had always coveted the connections that once opened doors now closing. When Isolde's mother died, Serafina had swooped in with offers of help that came laced with conditions, introductions in exchange for gratitude, gossip traded for favors. "I am quite well, thank you," Isolde replied, merely admiring the decorations. Serafina's smile thinned. "One must admire what one cannot afford, I suppose." She leaned closer, voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Lord Drake was asking after you earlier. Such a promising gentleman, ambitious, well-connected. He might overlook certain deficiencies, if approached correctly." The implication stung like nettles. Drake, smooth, calculating, with a reputation for collecting debts in ways that extended beyond mere coin. Isolde had felt his gaze on her all evening, proprietary and cold. "I shall consider all worthy prospects," Isolde said evenly, excusing herself before Serafina could press further. She needed distance. She nearly collided with a solid wall of black broadcloth. Strong hands steadied her elbows. She looked up, far up, into obsidian eyes that had haunted her since his arrival. "Lady Montague," Viscount Blackwood said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Up close, he was even more imposing. The faint scar along his jaw catching candlelight, the scent of sandalwood and winter air clinging to him. "You appear in need of rescue." Her heart stumbled. "I am managing perfectly well, my lord." One dark brow arched. "Are you?" His gaze flicked past her to where Serafina watched with avid curiosity, then to Lord Reginald's increasingly frantic gestures. Something unreadable tightened his features. "Perhaps you manage too much alone." Before she could form a reply, he released her and stepped back, inclining his head with formal courtesy. Yet the intensity of his regard lingered like a brand as he melted into the crowd. Isolde stood rooted, pulse racing. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen not the beautiful facade, not the desperate heiress to nothing, but the weight she carried, and named it truthfully. The orchestra struck up a new set. Around her, the ballroom spun on in glittering indifference. But inside Isolde, something shifted, fragile as the first crack in winter ice. What would you sacrifice to protect the ones you love, when every choice feels like betrayal of self? Share your thoughts below. The waltz had barely begun when Viscount Blackwood appeared at Isolde's side as though summoned by the music itself. One moment she stood alone, tracing idle patterns on the stem of her untouched glass. The next, a shadow fell across her, and the air shifted cooler, sharper, charged with something she could not name. "Lady Montague," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the swelling violins. "Dance with me." It was not a question. Not truly. The words carried the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to obedience. Yet beneath the command lay something else, an intensity that made her breath catch. Around them, conversations faltered. Fans stilled mid-flutter. The Viscount Blackwood did not dance. Not since his wife's death. That he should single out a penniless nobody was unthinkable. Isolde hesitated only a fraction of a heartbeat. To refuse would draw more notice than acceptance. She placed her gloved hand in his outstretched palm. The contact was immediate and startling. His fingers closed around hers with controlled strength, warm even through layers of kid leather, and a current seemed to travel up her arm, setting every nerve alight. He drew her onto the floor with effortless authority, positioning her precisely where he wished. One hand settled firmly at the small of her back, the other cradling hers as though it belonged there. The orchestra launched into the sweeping strains of a Viennese waltz, and they moved. He danced as he appeared to do everything else, masterfully, without flourish or wasted motion. Each step was measured, each turn executed with perfect balance, guiding her through the whirl of couples as though the crowded floor existed solely for them. Up close, he was overwhelming. The breadth of his shoulders blocking out the glittering chandeliers, the faint scar along his jaw catching light whenever he turned his head, the subtle scent of sandalwood and cold night air clinging to his coat. Isolde strove for composure, focusing on the familiar pattern of steps drilled into her since childhood. Yet her body betrayed her, her pulse racing, her breathing shallow. She had danced with countless partners over the years, each one assessing her as potential bride or pleasant diversion. None had ever made her feel so acutely aware of every inch of space between them, of the heat of his hand through silk and stays, of the way his dark gaze never left her face. "You tremble," he observed quietly, his voice a rumble she felt more than heard. His eyes, black, fathomless, searched hers with unsettling thoroughness. Fear or anticipation? The directness startled her. No gentleman spoke so plainly. She lifted her chin, summoning the serene mask she had perfected. "Neither, my lord. Merely the exertion of the dance." A faint curve touched one corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something dangerously close. "Liar," he said softly. "You tremble because you feel it too." Heat flooded her cheeks. She wanted to deny it, to retreat behind polite banalities, but the words would not come. Instead, she asked the question burning in her mind. "Why me?" They spun beneath a blaze of candlelight, skirts flaring like white flames. His grip tightened fractionally at her waist, steadying her through a daring turn that brought them closer than propriety allowed. "Because," he said, his breath brushing her temple, "every other woman in this room is performing. You are not." The music crested. Around them, whispers erupted like sparks from flint. The Viscount dancing at last, with Miss Montague of all people. What can he be thinking? But Isolde barely registered them. The world had narrowed to the pressure of his hand, the controlled power in his frame, the unyielding focus in his eyes. When the final notes faded, he did not release her immediately. For a suspended moment they stood at the center of the floor, the crowd a blurred halo around them, his hands still at her back as though reluctant to let go. Then, with deliberate grace, he offered his arm. "Walk with me." Again, not a request. She placed her fingers on his sleeve, feeling the hard muscle beneath superfine cloth, and allowed him to lead her through the throng. Gasps and speculative glances followed in their wake, but Blackwood ignored them with imperial disdain, steering her toward the tall glass doors that opened onto the terrace. The night air struck like icy water after the ballroom's heat. Frost glittered on the stone balustrade, their breath clouded in silver plumes. Below, the gardens lay sleeping under a thin blanket of snow, lanterns casting pools of gold along deserted paths. The music drifted out faintly, muffled by distance. He released her arm but remained close, one hand braced on the balustrade as he studied her profile. Silence stretched, heavy with expectation. At last he spoke, voice stripped of drawing-room polish. "Your father's debts are common knowledge in certain circles. The vultures circle closer every day." Isolde's heart lurched. She had expected speculation, not such brutal frankness. "That is hardly a fit subject. I deal in truths, Lady Montague, not polite fictions." He turned to face her fully, moonlight carving harsh shadows across his features. "I require a wife. You require rescue. The solution is obvious." The words struck like a physical blow. She had imagined proposals, dreamed of them in weaker moments, but never like this, cold, transactional, devoid of tenderness. "You mock me, my lord. I do not waste time on mockery." His gaze was steady, almost ruthless. "Marry me. Your family's debts will be settled in full. Your sister will have her season. Your father will keep what dignity remains to him. In return, I gain a viscountess who does not simper or scheme." Isolde's throat tightened. It was salvation wrapped in chains. Everything she had prayed for, offered without warmth or illusion. She searched his face for some hint of softness, some sign this was more than convenience, and found only iron resolve. "And what of affection?" she heard herself ask, voice barely above a whisper. "What of partnership or respect?" His expression did not alter, yet something flickered deep in his eyes. Pain quickly shuddered. "I offered affection once. It was returned with betrayal. I will not make that mistake again." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "But respect? That I can give. And protection. No one will dare slight you again." The wind stirred, carrying flakes of snow that melted against her heated skin. She thought of Alara's hopeful face, of her father's trembling hands, of the endless nights spent calculating how to stretch one more month, one more week. She thought of Seraphina's venomous smile, of Drake's predatory interest. And she thought of the way Blackwood had looked at her across the ballroom, not with pity or calculation, but with recognition, as though he saw the steel beneath her fragility. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I accept your proposal, my lord." For a moment he was utterly still. Then, slowly, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. The kiss was formal, brushing her knuckles through glove leather. Yet the pressure lingered a fraction longer than courtesy demanded, warm and deliberate. "Everett," he said quietly. "You will call me Everett." The snow began to fall in earnest, soft and silent around them. Isolde felt the world tilt, the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had stepped willingly into the storm, and only time would reveal whether it would shelter or destroy her. But in the moment his fingers tightened briefly around hers before releasing, she felt, for the first time in years, the faint, dangerous stirrings of hope. What would you risk for the promise of salvation? Your freedom, your heart, or both? Share your answer below. The wedding was quiet, almost austere, a special license, a small ceremony in the private chapel at Thornridge Manor, with only Isolde's father and sister in attendance, and a handful of Blackwood's most trusted retainers. No lavish breakfast followed, no triumphant procession through London. Society, deprived of spectacle, feasted instead on speculation. A hasty marriage, a penniless bride, a groom who had sworn never to wed again. The scandal sheets bloomed with veiled insinuations for a fortnight, then moved on to fresher prey. For Isolde, the first weeks of marriage passed in a haze of adjustment and cautious wonder. Thornridge Manor rose like a dark crown from its frost-laced parklands, all Gothic arches and mullioned windows that caught the winter sun in fractured rainbows. Inside, the house breathed history. Portraits of stern ancestors lining the long gallery, tapestries faded to ghostly elegance, the faint scent of beeswax and old leather permeating every corridor. Servants moved with silent efficiency, their deference absolute, yet Isolde sensed the subtle curiosity in their glances. She was the new Viscountess, an outsider who had crossed the threshold no other woman had managed in 3 years. Everett proved an enigmatic husband. By day he was courtesy itself, escorting her on tours of the estate, consulting her on menus and household matters with grave attention, ensuring her father's most pressing debts were quietly discharged within days of the wedding. Alara was promised a London season the following spring, complete with new wardrobe and dancing master. Lord Reginald wrote tear-stained letters of gratitude that Isolde folded away in a drawer, unsure whether to feel relief or resentment. Yet at night the distance returned. They occupied adjoining chambers, as was proper, but the connecting door remained firmly closed. Everett would bid her good evening with impeccable politeness after dinner, then retreat to his study or ride out across the darkened estate, returning long after she had sought her bed. When they met at breakfast, his conversation was pleasant, intellectual, politics, books, estate improvements, but never personal. He never spoke of his first marriage beyond that single, raw admission on the terrace. Isolde began to feel like a beautifully appointed guest in her own home. Still, there were moments, unexpected, electric, that kept hope flickering. One late afternoon she discovered him in the library, sleeves rolled to the elbow, poring over ledgers in a pool of winter sunlight. The sight of his strong forearms, the lock of dark hair falling across his brow, the quiet intensity of his concentration, struck her with sudden, aching force. He glanced up as she entered, and for an instant his guarded expression softened. "You play, I believe?" he asked, nodding toward the pianoforte in the adjoining music room, its lid closed for years. "I did once," she admitted. Music lessons had been among the first luxuries sacrificed. He rose, crossing to lift the lid with care, as though uncovering something fragile. Dust motes danced in the light as he ran a thumb across the keys, producing a soft, mournful chord. "The house has been too silent," he said quietly. "It would please me to hear it filled again." That evening, after dinner, she played for him, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Simple pieces remembered from girlhood, a Mozart sonata, a wistful air by Handel. When she finished, the final notes hanging in the firelit drawing room, he remained motionless for a long moment. "Thank you," he said at last, voice rough. Then he stood abruptly and left the room. Such moments accumulated like scattered pearls, his hand steadying her when she stumbled on an icy path, the way his gaze lingered when she entered a room, the rare, brief laughter he allowed himself over some shared observation. Each one tightened the invisible thread between them, even as the greater distance remained. Society, however, refused to let them retreat into privacy. Invitations began to arrive, cautious at first, then in a steady stream. The Viscountess Blackwood could not be ignored forever. Their first major appearance was a ball hosted by the Duchess of Ashford, a dragon of the ton whose approval could make or break reputations. Everett accepted with cool inevitability. "You need not fear," he told Isolde as their carriage rolled through the torchlit streets. "I will not leave your side." Yet fear coiled in her stomach all the same. The Ashford ballroom dwarfed Eldridge Hall in splendor. Ceilings painted with mythological scenes, walls draped in crimson silk, chandeliers blazing like captive constellations. They entered to a ripple of attention, curiosity, assessment, envy. Isolde wore sapphire silk that evening, a gift from Everett chosen to bring out the storm gray of her eyes. She felt his approving glance as he handed her down from the carriage, but once inside, the old insecurities resurfaced. Lady Seraphina Vale was among the first to approach, resplendent in emerald satin, her smile honed to a blade's edge. "Cousin, how transformed you are," she purred, eyes flicking over the gown, the blackwood sapphires at Isolde's throat. "Marriage agrees with you. One might almost forget your circumstances." Everett's arm tensed beneath Isolde's hand. "Lady Vale," he greeted coolly, "your solicitude is noted." Seraphina's smile did not waver. "I merely observe that some alliances are more fortunate than others. Lord Drake was quite cast down by the news, you know. He had hopes." At the mention of Drake's name, Isolde felt Everett's grip tighten fractionally. Drake himself appeared moments later, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. His blonde good looks and easy charm masked the calculation Isolde had always sensed. "Lady Blackwood," he drawled, "you shine tonight, though I confess surprise, your elevation was so sudden. One wonders what persuaded his lordship to act with such haste." The implication hung heavy. Everett's response was ice. "One might wonder many things, Drake. Few of them worth voicing." Drake's smile thinned, but he retreated under the weight of Everett's stare. Later, during supper, Seraphina contrived to sit opposite them. Conversation turned inevitably to parliamentary matters, Everett's known opposition to certain trade bills Drake supported. Seraphina's questions were innocent on the surface, but Isolde recognized the probing beneath. Seeking weaknesses, alliances, leverage. As the evening wore on, Everett drew Isolde aside to a quiet alcove. "They circle like wolves," he muttered, frustration etching his features. "Drake covets influence in the lords. Seraphina covets whatever she cannot have. They will not rest." Isolde laid a hand on his arm. "Then we give them nothing to feed on." His gaze softened as he looked down at her. For a heartbeat, the noise of the ballroom receded, and she thought he might kiss her, here in full view, claiming her utterly. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed a brief, fierce kiss to her gloved knuckles. "Together," he said simply. That night, in the carriage returning home, exhaustion and champagne loosened her tongue. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying beneath you, for convenience?" The silence stretched so long she feared he would not answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost wondering. "I have regretted many things in my life, Isolde. You are not one of them." Snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent against the windows. She leaned her head against the squabs, heart aching with something too complex for hope or fear. The thread between them had drawn tighter tonight, frayed in places, perhaps, but unbroken. Back at Thornridge, as she prepared for bed, a folded note appeared beneath her chamber door. No seal, only her name in Everett's strong hand. "You played beautifully tonight. The house is less silent because of you. E." She pressed the paper to her lips, a smile trembling there in the candlelight. Tangled alliances threatened from without, but within these walls, something real was growing, slow, cautious, but undeniable. In that quiet moment, Isolde began to believe they might yet forge more than a bargain. They might forge a future. When the stakes rise and old enemies begin to circle, would you hold fast to a fragile new bond, or retreat behind safer walls? Tell me your choice below. The letter arrived on a morning when the sky hung low and iron gray, threatening snow that refused to fall. Isolde was in the morning room, arranging hothouse roses in a porcelain vase. Everett's quiet gesture, delivered without comment by the head gardener, when the footman presented the silver salver. A single folded sheet, heavy cream paper, no seal. only her name in an unfamiliar hand. She broke it open idly, expecting an invitation or a charitable appeal. The words struck like a slap. "My Lord Blackwood, it is with regret that I must alert you to certain facts regarding your recent marriage. The lady you have elevated to Viscountess entered the union with debts far exceeding what is commonly known. Debts concealed not only from society but, it would appear, from yourself. Her motives were purely mercenary. She has boasted in private correspondence of securing her family's future at any cost. Enclosed you will find copies of ledgers bearing her father's seal, and a note in her own hand acknowledging the deception. A concerned friend. No signature. Only 2 enclosures. A page torn from an account book showing sums that made Isolde's stomach plummet, and a brief note in what appeared to be her own handwriting. Identical slant, identical flourish on the capital I, thanking an unnamed party for securing the match that will save us all. Her hands went numb. The forgery was masterful. She had never written those words, never seen that ledger page. But presented thus, stripped of context, they painted a damning picture. The door opened. Everett entered, still in riding coat, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. He paused at the sight of her face. "What is it?" She could not speak. Wordlessly, she held out the letter. He read it in silence, his expression hardening with every line. When he reached the enclosures, a muscle ticked in his jaw. The silence that followed was worse than any outburst. "Is this true?" he asked at last. His voice was quiet, lethal. "No," the denial came out hoarse. "Everett, I swear to you. The handwriting." He held up the forged note. "It is yours." "It is not." She stepped toward him, desperate. "Look closer. The ink is too fresh, the pressure of the pen different. Someone has copied my hand. Someone who wishes us harm." His eyes, those obsidian eyes that had once looked at her with dawning warmth, were shuttered now, cold as winter midnight. "And the debts? You never spoke of their full extent." Heat flooded her cheeks, shame, not guilt. "I was ashamed. I thought, once we were married, once you had settled the worst of them, the rest could be managed quietly. I never meant to deceive you." He turned away, staring out at the bleak parkland. Deception by omission is still deception. The words hung between them like a blade. That evening, society converged on the opera. Everett had accepted the box weeks earlier. To cry off now would fuel speculation. They went, side by side in the carriage, the space between them vast as an ocean. Conversation was limited to neutral pleasantries about the weather, the performance, the crush in the foyer. Isolde felt every eye upon them, sensed the whispers even when she could not hear the words. During the first interval, Lord Harlan Drake appeared at the door of their box, all smiling solicitude. "Lady Blackwood, you are in excellent looks," he said, bowing. His gaze flicked to Everett, amusement gleaming. "Though I confess surprise at seeing you both. One hears such distressing rumors these days. Fortunes misrepresented, motives questioned. I do hope all is well." Everett rose, his movement deceptively calm. "Your concern is noted, Drake, as is its source." Drake's smile did not waver, merely repeating what is on everyone's lips. A hasty marriage, a bride with complications. One wonders if full disclosure was made. Isolde's nails dug into her palms. She felt Everett's tension beside her, coiled and dangerous. "Leave," Everett said quietly. "Now." Drake bowed again, mockingly graceful, and withdrew. The second act passed in a blur of music Isolde could not hear. When the final curtain fell, they returned home in silence. In the entrance hall, Everett paused. "I will sleep in my dressing room tonight," he said. "I need time." He left her standing beneath the great chandelier, its candles guttering like dying stars. The days that followed were agony. Everett was meticulously polite. Breakfast served at precise hours, inquiries after her health, discussions of estate matters, but the warmth had vanished. He rode out early, returned late, spent evenings in his study with the door closed. Isolde wandered the great house like a ghost, the silence pressing in from all sides. Servants averted their eyes, sensing the fracture. She tried once to breach the wall. Finding him in the library, she laid a hand on his sleeve. "Everett, please. Let me explain." He pulled away, not roughly, but with finality. "I believed you different," he said, voice raw. "I thought you could not lie to me. I was wrong." The pain in his words cut deeper than anger. She saw the old wound reopened, the betrayal of his first wife, the trust he had risked offering again, now bleeding afresh. That night, alone in her vast bedchamber, Isolde finally allowed the tears to come. She had saved her family only to lose the one thing that had begun to matter more: the fragile, precious connection with the man who had seen her truly. Yet even in despair, a cold clarity emerged. The forgery was too perfect, the timing too convenient. Only someone with access to her writing desk, someone who knew the exact sums of her father's debts, could have crafted such a weapon. Serafina had visited just days before the letter arrived. Serafina, allied with Drake, who coveted Everett's parliamentary influence and would delight in humbling him through his choice of bride. This was no random malice. This was calculated war. The following afternoon, Isolde found Everett in the stables, overseeing the shoeing of his hunter. She approached without preamble. "I know who sent the letter," she said. "Serafina, possibly with Drake's help. They seek to drive us apart because together we threaten their ambitions." He did not look at her immediately, focusing on the horse's hoof as the smith worked. When he finally met her gaze, exhaustion shadowed his eyes. "And if you are wrong, I am not." She stepped closer, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But even if I were, even if every accusation were true, would you cast me aside without a hearing?" For a long moment he was silent. Then, slowly, he reached out and brushed a stray curl from her cheek, the first voluntary touch in days. His fingers lingered against her skin. "I do not want to believe the worst of you," he admitted quietly. "But I have been burned once before." The scars run deep. The vulnerability in his voice undid her. She covered his hand with hers, holding it to her face. "Then let me show you the truth," she whispered. "Not with words, with time, with everything I am." Something shifted in his expression. Pain, longing, the first crack in the ice. He turned his hand to cradle her cheek fully, thumb tracing the path of a tear she had not realized had fallen. That evening, after dinner, he came to her chamber. The connecting door opened without knock or ceremony. He stood framed in the doorway, coat discarded, cravat loosened, looking suddenly younger, less armored. Isolde rose from her dressing table, heart pounding. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, almost punishing. Grief and need and apology poured into the crush of his mouth on hers. She responded with equal desperation, fingers tangling in his hair, pressing herself against the hard length of him as though she could erase the distance of the past days through sheer force of will. When they broke apart, breathing ragged, his forehead rested against hers. "I was a fool," he said roughly. "I let old ghosts make me doubt you. And I was a fool for hiding anything from you," she answered, voice trembling. "No more secrets, on either side." He drew back slightly, searching her face. Then, with deliberate tenderness, he kissed her again. Slowly this time, reverently, as though relearning the shape of trust. Later, lying tangled in the sheets, moonlight silvering the bedchamber, he traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "Drake and your cousin will not stop," he murmured. "They want more than our unhappiness. They want power." Isolde turned to face him, determination hardening her soft mouth. "Then we give them war." In the quiet aftermath of passion, with his arms wrapped securely around her, the fracture began to mend, stronger, perhaps, for having been tested. Trust was not yet whole, but it was no longer shattered. Outside, Snow finally began to fall, soft and relentless, blanketing the world in silence. When betrayal strikes at the heart of a fragile love, would you fight to rebuild trust, or walk away to protect what remains of your heart? Share your thoughts below. The snow that had begun to fall the night trust was rebuilt turned traitor within a week. A fierce blizzard swept down from the north, blanketing Thornridge in white silence and sealing the estate in isolation. Roads became impassable. Post was delayed. Even the hardy tenants stayed huddled by their hearths. For Isolde, the storm outside mirrored the one gathering within. At first, the enforced seclusion felt like a gift. With no visitors, no demands from society, she and Everett existed in a fragile cocoon. Mornings were spent in the library, heads bent over correspondence as they began quietly gathering evidence against Seraphina and Drake. Letters, witnesses, discrepancies in accounts. Afternoons brought long walks through the snow-muffled gardens, gloved hands brushing as they discussed strategy. Evenings stretched languidly before the fire. Shared suppers, quiet conversation, music when Isolde played and Everett listened with eyes half closed, the tension in his shoulders easing note by note. Nights where there's alone. The connecting door remained open now, a silent invitation. Passion, once unleashed, became a language more honest than words. Fierce one moment, achingly tender the next. In the aftermath, with firelight gilding their skin, Everett traced slow patterns along her spine and spoke of things he had buried for years. The slow erosion of his first marriage, the discovery of his wife's infidelity with a man he had called friend, the public humiliation that had followed. Isolde listened without judgment, offering in return the full truth of her family's fall, the shame she had carried like a secret wound. "We are both scarred," she whispered once, curled against his chest. "Perhaps that is why we fit." He pressed a kiss to her temple. Perhaps. Yet even in intimacy, doubt lingered like frost at the edges of a windowpane. Everett's parliamentary allies began to withdraw. Letters arrived, delayed by snow, but no less cutting, expressing concern over recent rumors. Invitations for the upcoming season dwindled to nothing. The scandal sheets, when they finally reached Thornridge bundled with belated post, carried veiled barbs, questions about the Viscount's judgment, hints that his new bride's connections might prove embarrassing in political circles. Drake and Seraphina had not been idle. One frozen morning, a visitor braved the roads. Lord Reginald Montague, Isolde's father, half-frozen and wild-eyed. He was shown into the drawing room where Isolde and Everett were reviewing estate accounts. The change in him was shocking. Gaunt, unshaven, his fine coat threadbare at the cuffs. "They have called in the last notes," he blurted without preamble, hands trembling as he clutched a sheaf of papers. "Everything. The house in town, gone by month's end. The remaining land, seized unless payment is made within a fortnight. They say it was your marriage that provoked it, that certain parties resent the alliance and wish to punish us all." Isolde's blood ran cold. Everett took the papers, scanning them with grim focus. The demands were real and ruinous. Sums her father had hidden even from her, gambling debts piled atop old loans. "I thought Blackwood's settlement covered," Lord Reginald began. "It covered what I knew of," Everett said quietly. His gaze flicked to Isolde, and in that brief moment she saw the shadow return. The question he dared not voice, had she known? She rose, crossing to her father. "We will manage this," she said firmly, though fear clawed at her throat. "Together." But that night, alone in the study after her father had been settled in a guest chamber, Everett's restraint cracked. "How much more is there?" he asked, voice low. "How many more secrets?" The accusation, unspoken but unmistakable, hung between them. "There are no more," Isolde answered, aching. "I knew nothing of these latest debts. Father hid them out of shame." He paced to the window, staring out at the endless white. "And yet they surface now, precisely when Drake needs leverage. It is too convenient." "You think I planned this?" Pain sharpened her words. "That I am part of some scheme?" He turned, anguish in his eyes. "I think I want desperately to believe you." But every time I lower my guard, another blade appears. The silence stretched, brutal. At last he left the room without another word. The abyss opened fully in the days that followed. Everett withdrew again, politely, devastatingly. Meals were taken separately, to allow work uninterrupted. He rode out at dawn and returned after dark. When they passed in corridors, his bow was formal, his conversation confined to necessities. The connecting door remained closed. Isolde felt herself unraveling thread by thread. Servants' pitying glances followed her. Her father, racked with guilt, took to his bed with a chill. Even the house seemed to turn against her. Drafts whistling through windows, fires burning low, shadows lengthening in empty rooms. She wandered the gallery at night, staring at portraits of Blackwood brides who had reigned here with confidence and security. None had come to it penniless, burdened by scandal. One particularly bitter evening, a packet of letters finally fought through the snow, forwarded from London. Among them was one in Seraphina's elegant, spiteful hand. Dearest cousin, how trying the country must be in winter. One hears Thornridge is quite cut off. Perhaps a respite from certain unpleasantness. Lord Drake sends his regards and suggests that a quiet annulment might yet preserve everyone's dignity. After all, some matches are simply ill-advised from the start. Ever your devoted kin. The veiled threat was clear. Yield, or face total destruction. Isolde's hands shook as she burned the letter in the library grate. Watching the flames devour Seraphina's words, something inside her hardened. She had fought too hard, come too far to crumble now. But the cost weighed heavy. That night she sat before her dressing table mirror long after the house slept, studying her reflection as though it belonged to a stranger. The woman staring back was pale, eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, yet there was steel beneath the fragility. She had survived her mother's death, her family's fall, society's scorn. She would survive this, yet the fear gnawed relentless. What if Everett could not? She imagined life without him. The cold return to a diminished existence. Her father broken, Alara's future blighted. Worse was the ache of losing what they had begun to build. The laughter in quiet moments, the way his touch banished loneliness, the rare, precious vulnerability he had shown only to her. Tears came then, silent and scalding. In the depths of that abyss, Isolde confronted the truth she had evaded since the terrace proposal. This had never been merely a bargain for her. Somewhere between the first waltz and the nights spent in his arms, she had fallen irrevocably in love with Everett Blackwood, scars, silences, and all. And now she stood on the brink of losing him. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves like a living thing, driving snow against the windows in frantic assault. Inside, Isolde pressed her forehead to the cold glass and whispered into the dark the words she had not yet dared say aloud. I love you. Please God, do not let this destroy us. But in the hollow silence that answered, doubt echoed loudest of all. When everything you have fought for threatens to slip away, and the person you love most begins to doubt you, would you cling tighter, or let go to spare them further pain? Tell me what you would choose. The blizzard broke on the 10th day, as suddenly as it had come. A weak sun rose over a world transformed, every branch heavy with snow, the parkland glittering like a vast diamond field. Servants bustled to clear paths. Smoke rose straight and thin from cottage chimneys. The isolation was over, but the damage lingered. Isolde stood at her chamber window watching the thaw begin, a single drop of meltwater tracing down the pane like a tear. She had not slept. Everett had not come to her bed in a week. The connecting door remained closed like a verdict. Her father's debts hung over them all, a sword poised to fall. And beneath everything pulsed the raw ache of knowing the man she loved doubted her. Again, she pressed her palm to the cold glass. Enough. She had bowed to circumstance long enough. If Everett could not trust her fully, she would prove herself undeniable. That afternoon she sought him in the estate office, where he sat surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, his profile stark against the window. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering across his features before the familiar guard settled. Isolde! The sound of her name in his deep voice, careful, distant, cut her, but she did not falter. She closed the door firmly behind her. "We must speak," she said. "Truly speak. No more silence." He leaned back in his chair, gesturing to the seat opposite. She remained standing. "I know you doubt me," she began, voice steady though her heart thundered. "I see it every time you look at me these past days. You fear another betrayal. You fear I am party to whatever scheme Drake and Serafina weave." His jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. "I am not," she continued, "but words have failed us both. So I will show you." She laid a folded paper on the desk between them, a list in her neat hand. "These are the dates Serafina visited since our marriage. These are the servants who attended her. This is the stationery missing from my writing desk after her last call. And this," she placed a second sheet beside the first, "is a letter from my father's man of business confirming the new debts were purchased by a third party only last month. A third party acting through intermediaries. The trail leads to Drake." Everett's eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages. "You have been investigating." "I have been fighting," she corrected quietly. "For us, while you withdrew." The words landed like a blow. He rose slowly, coming around the desk until he stood before her. "I withdrew because I was terrified," he admitted, voice rough. "Not of ruin, of losing you to my own mistrust. Every time I let myself believe, something rises to punish me for it." Isolde's throat ached. "Then stop punishing us both." She reached up, framing his face with cold hands. "I love you, Everett. Not your title, not your wealth. You, the man who dances like a storm, who listens to my music as though it saves him, who kisses me like I am both salvation and sin. I love you with every scarred, stubborn piece of you." His breath caught. For a moment he was utterly still, eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "I have been a coward," he said at last, "hiding behind old wounds instead of standing beside you." He pulled her into his arms then, crushing her against him as though afraid she might vanish. She clung back, feeling the tremor in his powerful frame. "Forgive me," he whispered against her hair. "I was drowning in ghosts. You are my present, my future. I will not doubt you again." The kiss that followed was fierce with apology and renewal, tasting of salt and longing. When they drew apart, foreheads touching, resolve shone bright in both their eyes. "Together," he said, echoing his words from the ball. "Together," she affirmed. They began that very day. Everett summoned his solicitor from London, braving the still treacherous roads. Isolde wrote careful letters to old family connections, women who had known Serafina since girlhood, gentlemen who had lost money in Drake's schemes. Piece by piece, the web emerged. Forged documents, bribed clerks, whispers planted in drawing rooms. Drake sought to discredit Everett's opposition to a lucrative trade bill he championed. Serafina, bitter at Isolde's rise and her own stagnant prospects, had provided the intimate knowledge needed to wound deepest. One evening, as they pored over evidence in the firelit library, Everett paused, watching Isolde annotate a letter with fierce concentration. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "I married you to save you. Instead, you are saving me." She looked up, a wry smile curving her lips. "We are saving each other. That is rather the point, is it not?" He rounded the table, pulling her to her feet and into another kiss. This one slow, reverent. Later, in bed with moonlight spilling across the sheets, he traced the line of her collarbone. "I have something for you," he murmured. From the bedside drawer he drew a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring, a single sapphire surrounded by diamonds, old and exquisite. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said, "the only Blackwood bride who married for love alone. I want you to have it, not as payment for a bargain, but as promise of one freely given. Tears blurred Isolde's vision as he slipped it onto her finger beside her wedding band. "I love you," he said simply, the words unguarded at last. "Wholly, irrevocably. And I you," she whispered. Outside, the thaw continued, snow sliding from branches in soft thuds, water dripping from eaves. Inside, something frozen long ago finally began to melt. They were not yet safe. Drake and Serafina still schemed, society still watched, debts still loomed. But the abyss had been crossed. Trust, tested and tempered, now burned brighter than any doubt. As Isolde drifted to sleep in Everett's arms, she felt the first true spark of hope ignite into flame. Whatever storm came next, they would meet it side by side, united, unafraid, unbreakable. When the moment comes to fight for a love nearly lost, would you risk everything to rebuild it, or walk away while something remains? Share your truth below. London in early spring was a city reborn. Hyacinths blooming in window boxes, the Thames glinting under pale sunlight, carriages thronging the streets as the ton poured back for the season. Yet for Isolde and Everett, the return felt less like renewal than marching into battle. The evidence they had gathered over the winter was damning. Letters in Serafina's hand arranging payments to a clerk who had adjusted ledgers. A sworn statement from a former Drake associate detailing bribes meant to sway votes on the trade bill. Receipts tracing funds from Drake's accounts to the sudden calling in of Lord Reginald's remaining debts. It was enough, barely, to bring before sympathetic members of the House of Lords, but not without risk. One misstep, one whisper of sour grapes, and the accusations could rebound, painting Everett as a vindictive husband shielding a grasping wife. They chose their moment carefully. The night of Lady Willoughby's grand ball, the unofficial opening of the season, where half the peerage would gather under one roof. Isolde dressed with deliberate armor that evening, emerald silk to match her new confidence, the blackwood sapphires at her throat and the grandmother's ring gleaming on her finger. Everett, in severe black, looked every inch the formidable Viscount as he handed her into the carriage. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, taking her hand, "we face it together." She squeezed his fingers. Together. Lady Willoughby's mansion blazed with light. Chandeliers rivaled the stars. Hothouse flowers scented the air with dizzying sweetness. They entered to a hush that rippled outward. Curiosity, calculation, lingering scandal. Isolde felt every gaze like pins, but she lifted her chin and met them steadily. She was no longer the trembling girl at the edge of the ballroom. Serafina was among the first to approach, resplendent in poisonous yellow, Lord Drake at her side like a sleek blonde shadow. "Cousin?" Serafina purred, eyes flicking over Isolde's jewels with ill-concealed envy. How bold to appear after such a winter of seclusion. One wondered if Thornridge had become a prison. Everett's smile was glacial. On the contrary, Lady Vale, it proved most illuminating. Drake's eyes narrowed. Indeed, one hears disturbing tales of financial embarrassment. Such a pity when alliances prove unequal. The opening salvo fired. The crowd around them leaned in like hounds scenting blood. Isolde felt Everett tense, but before he could reply, she stepped forward, voice clear and carrying. "Embarrassment, my lord? Perhaps you refer to those who purchase debts not to collect, but to coerce, or who forge letters to sow discord. Strange practices for a gentleman of honor." Gasps fluttered. Serafina's smile faltered. Drake recovered swiftly, laughing. "Strong accusations, Lady Blackwood. One might demand proof." Everett's voice cut through like a blade. "Proof can be arranged. In the proper forum." The orchestra struck up a waltz. Everett offered Isolde his arm. "Shall we?" They took the floor as all eyes followed. Midway through the second turn, Everett leaned close. "Now," he murmured. At his signal, two trusted allies, Lord Ashcombe and the Earl of Rivwharton, both powerful in the Lords and indebted to Everett for past favors, began discreetly circulating documents among key peers. Whispers spread faster than dance steps. Ledgers, affidavits, damning connections. Serafina noticed first. Her face drained of color as Rivorton handed a packet to her husband, who blanched and passed it on. Drake intercepted one, scanning it with growing fury. The music ended. Everett led Isolde from the floor toward the card room, where a cluster of influential lords had gathered. Drake followed, Serafina trailing like a storm cloud. "You go too far, Blackwood," Drake hissed, voice low but venomous. "These forgeries are yours," Everett finished coldly, "as multiple witnesses will attest when the matter is brought before the lords next week." The room stilled. Even the distant orchestra seemed to fade. Drake's composure cracked. "You would ruin us over a penniless." Everett stepped forward, towering and lethal. "Speak of my wife again," he said, voice deadly quiet, "and ruin will be the least of your concerns." Serafina clutched Drake's arm, eyes darting for escape. Finding none, she turned on Isolde with raw hatred. "You think you've won?" she spat. A jumped-up pauper playing Lady of the Manor. Isolde met her gaze without flinching. "I think," she said clearly, "that envy is a poor disguise for guilt. You taught me long ago what cruelty looks like, cousin. Tonight, society sees it plainly." A murmur of agreement rose from the watching lords, some shocked, others nodding. The tide had turned. Drake made one last desperate lunge. "This is slander. I demand satisfaction." Everett's smile was wolfish. "Name your seconds, then." "Dawn tomorrow suits me." The challenge hung in the air like gunpowder. Ladies gasped. Gentlemen exchanged grim glances. Duels were illegal, but honor sometimes demanded them still. Isolde's heart lurched. She gripped Everett's arm. "No." He covered her hand with his, eyes never leaving Drake. "He will withdraw the demand," he said with calm certainty, "because he knows the evidence is irrefutable, and cowards do not face pistols at dawn." Drake's face twisted, rage, fear, calculation. Around him, peers turned away, conversations resuming with deliberate exclusion. Serafina stood abandoned, her yellow gown suddenly garish in the unforgiving light. At last Drake bowed stiffly. "Perhaps the matter is best settled in Parliament." "Coward's choice," Everett said softly, "but wise." The orchestra struck up again, as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had. As the evening wore on, allies approached with quiet congratulations. Invitations would flow again. The Blackwoods had not only survived, they had triumphed. Serafina and Drake slipped away early, faces pale masks. Later, in the carriage home, Isolde leaned against Everett's shoulder, exhaustion and exhilaration warring within her. "You were magnificent," he murmured, kissing her temple. "We were," she corrected. "I could not have done it without you." He tilted her chin up, eyes shining in the passing street lamp glow. "Nor I without you." You faced them all unflinching. "My warrior." The kiss that followed was slow, deep, sealing victory and promise alike. Dawn the next day brought confirmation. Drake's political allies distanced themselves. Petitions circulated demanding inquiry into his dealings. Serafina's invitations dried up overnight. The storm had broken, and the Blackwoods stood at its calm center. Stronger, united, invincible. In the quiet of Thornridge's master chamber that night, with spring rain pattering against the windows, Everett drew Isolde close. "It is over," he whispered against her skin. "No," she answered, smiling into his shoulder. "It is only beginning." Outside, the first green buds swelled on the trees. Inside, love, tested in fire, forged in storm, burned bright and unbreakable. If you stood at the edge of victory after the fiercest battle, what would you savor most, the triumph or the arms of the one who fought beside you? Tell me below. Summer came gently to Thornridge that year, as though the estate itself exhaled after holding its breath through winter's trials. The great house bloomed with new life, windows thrown open to warm breezes, fresh flowers in every room, the long gallery ringing with music when Isolde played an Alara, now launched into her first triumphant season. practiced duets with her sister, Lord Reginald. Debts finally settled and pride cautiously restored, took up residence in a comfortable dower house on the estate, where he spent afternoons fishing and evenings regaling his granddaughters to be, he hoped, with gently edited tales of past glories. Society, ever fickle, embraced the Blackwoods with renewed fervor. The scandal that had threatened to consume them became instead the stuff of legend. The Viscountess who faced down her enemies with grace and steel, the Viscount who defended his chosen bride with unyielding devotion. Invitations flooded in. Seats at their table became coveted. Drake's influence crumbled under formal inquiry. He retreated to his lesser estates, reputation in tatters. Seraphina's husband quietly separated from her, and she vanished into obscure continental travel. Isolde and Everett attended the season's highlights when duty demanded, but their true joy lay in quiet moments at home. Long rides across sunlit parkland. Evenings on the terrace watching stars emerge. Lazy mornings when the household discreetly delayed breakfast, allowing the master and mistress to linger abed. One golden afternoon in July, Everett led Isolde blindfolded through the gardens, her laughter echoing as she protested. "Patience, wife," he teased, guiding her carefully down a familiar path. When he removed the silk scarf from her eyes, she gasped. The rose garden, once formal and severe, had been transformed. New beds spilled over with blooms in every shade. White for purity, pink for gratitude, deep red for passion. At the center stood a marble sundial newly engraved. To Isolde, my heart's true north. Tears blurred her vision. "It's beautiful. Not half so beautiful as you," he said, drawing her close. "I wanted a place that honors what you brought here, life, color, joy, after so much darkness." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, tasting summer on his lips. That autumn brought confirmation of another blessing, the quickening of new life beneath Isolde's hand. Everett's reaction, wonder, fierce protectiveness, and a tenderness that brought tears to her own eyes, became her most cherished memory. On a crisp December evening, snow falling softly as it had the year before, they stood together in the long gallery. Portraits of past Blackwood brides looked down, some haughty, some serene, but Isolde's would join them soon, painted in the full bloom of happiness. Everett wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands splayed gently over the curve where their child grew. "Do you regret anything?" he asked softly, echoing the question he had once posed in doubt. She turned in his embrace, smiling up at him. "Only that we wasted time on fear, but even that brought us here." He kissed her forehead, then her lips. "Here is everything." Outside, snow blanketed the world in peace. Inside Thornridge Manor, love, hard-won, deeply rooted, flourished eternal. Years later, their children would run laughing through those same rose gardens, and the story would be told. How a penniless bride and a wounded viscount found in each other not salvation alone, but a love fierce enough to remake their world. And beneath the grandmother's sapphire on Isolde's hand, the inscription Everett had added in secret gleamed, "Forever my warrior, forever my heart." How did this journey from storm to dawn touch you? What moment lingered longest? Share below, I would truly love to know.